This webinar is the 5 secrets to understanding pivot tables. My name is John Acampora, and I'm going to be your host for this training today. So you're in the right spot if you've heard that you need to learn pivot tables, but you're not sure why. Maybe it's a question that's come up on a job interview, or you spend a lot of time trying to summarize and analyze data with complex formulas. So we all know that can be frustrating, difficult at times. Or you've tried to use pivot tables, but you're just frustrated with the inconsistent results you're getting. Or maybe you've inherited a file from someone else that has pivot tables in it, but you're not really sure how they work, and you spend a lot of time guessing, a lot of time dragging and dropping those fields everywhere and just trying to figure out how these things work. And that might cause you to feel these ways with Excel. Maybe just overwhelmed. Your bosses have a bunch of tasks for you to work on, a bunch of projects. Or like I said, maybe this has come up on a job interview, this question about pivot tables, and you just weren't sure about what answer to give. So on today's agenda, we're going to cover the 5 secrets to understanding pivot tables. Everything you need to know to get started with pivot tables. We're going to look at what a pivot table is, why there's such a magical tool in Excel. We're going to cover the 4 different areas of pivot tables and what each of those does. We're also going to look at pivot table mechanics, exactly how they work, and the absolute critical step of getting the source data in the correct layout. Absolutely critical. And then the 8 rules for formatting your source data. So I'll also send out the files that I use today after the training. I have an Excel file, as long as a few quick guides that will help you remember everything and get started using pivot tables. But for right now, you can actually close down Excel, silence all the distractions, close the email if possible, and just focus on the training, take notes. I sent out a handout. You can take notes on that if you have it. If you don't worry about it. Just take some notes. And so I'll just very quickly introduce myself. Again, my name is John Acampora. I've spent most of my career as a financial analyst, business systems analyst, doing corporate finance and accounting type roles. I started the Excel Campus blog and YouTube channel to help others like yourself learn Excel and VBA. And it's grown massively over the last few years, well over 100,000 subscribers on both those platforms. And it's just so awesome to see so many people enthusiastic about learning Excel. Absolutely love it. I've taught millions of people about pivot tables as well. I absolutely love talking about pivot tables because, like I said, they're an awesome tool. I've also been a Microsoft Excel MVP since 2014, and that's an award program through Microsoft. One of the benefits there is that I get to communicate with the Excel team at Microsoft, the product team that develops the product, see what's coming next in the product, give them feedback, and also pass along your feedback as well to really help them improve the product. They are working on it and making a lot of great changes. So it's a cool program. And of course, I love Excel and I use it all day, every day. I am a huge Excel geek. I'm actually wearing an Excel t-shirt right now. I should have put the camera on or something, but I'm an Excel geek. So enough about me. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first tip with learning pivot tables is understanding what a pivot table is and how it can help us with our job, how it can help save us time with our job. So I'm going to jump over to Excel. Don't worry, you don't have to stare at my slides all day today. We are going to get into Excel here. And I have an Excel file here. Oops. And I'm just going to quickly first build out a pivot table, also a pivot chart, and create a little interactive dashboard just very quickly. Just go through this quickly first just to demo what a pivot table is. And so here I have some source data, or just a data set here, and this is just sales transactions. You can see each row here just represents one sales transaction. It has an invoice number, date, year, quarter, customer name, region, product, and then quantity and revenue. So very, very simple data set. You might have something that looks like this or a little bit more complex. But the whole job of the pivot table is to create summary reports and analyze this data very quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to select a cell here inside the pivot table, go to the Insert tab. A cell inside the data range, and go to Insert tab, choose Pivot Table. And then Excel is going to find that table for us. It could be a regular range, or in this case, I'm using an Excel table. This is the name of the table. So you can see in the background that Excel's found that for us. We're going to put this pivot table on an existing worksheet in cell K5 right here, K5, there we go. And then we're going to leave this add to data model blank. This is for Power Pivot, and we don't need that now, so we will not check that box. We'll go ahead and hit OK. So that's added the pivot table here in this area within the sheet. Let me scroll up a little bit. And now here we can use the pivot table fields list over here on the right side to build out this pivot table. So let's say we want to see a summary report of revenue by region. We have revenue here in column I, we have region here in column F. So to do that with the pivot table, I can just quickly take the region field, drag it into the rows area. I'll take the revenue field, drag it into the values area, and the pivot table is displaying now a sum of revenue by region. So just very quickly, we've created this summary report. And of course, pivot tables are extremely flexible, so we can change this, we can add to this. Maybe we want to see a trend here, so we'll put quarters in the columns area. And now we have a sum of revenue by region by quarter. We have this trend going across the top. And maybe we want to filter this down, and so we can take our product field, put that in the filters area, and now we have this filter drop-down menu up here, and we can apply a filter to the entire pivot table. So now we're just seeing sum of revenue by quarter, by region, for product 2 only. So you can see how we've quickly customized this report. Now, I went very fast there, so don't worry about following all those steps and trying to remember all that. I'm just giving you a quick demo first to show you what a pivot table does and how it can make our lives easier. So now we have this report here, and like I said, these pivot tables are very flexible. So we could change this up. Maybe we don't want to see quarters across the top. We can just drag that field out of there to remove it, and now we just have a sum of revenue by region. Now, another cool feature of pivot tables is pivot charts. So we can create interactive charts and dashboards based on our pivot table. So I'm just going to select a cell inside the pivot table here. Go to the analyze, or this might say options if you're in Excel 2010 and earlier, and go to that tab and then choose pivot chart. And that'll bring up the insert chart window. You might have seen this before for regular charts. It's very similar for pivot charts. And there's a lot of different chart types we can choose from. We're just going to use this standard column chart, this clustered column here, and go ahead and hit OK. And that will add the chart to our sheet. I'm just going to move it over here a little bit. So now we have a pivot chart that's connected to this pivot table. And as the pivot table changes, maybe we filter this for product 1 instead of product 2, that will change our pivot chart as well. So these are both connected, and any changes made to the pivot table are reflected in our pivot chart. Of course, you can go customize this further and modify the formatting. And then we can also add slicers. So I'm going to just select the pivot table here again, or you could select the pivot chart, go to the Analyze or Options tab, and we're going to choose Insert Slicer. And let's insert a few slicers. And slicers are basically filters. They're interactive filters that are much more visual. I'm just going to quickly line these up over here. Of course, you might want to spend more time doing that. I'm not going to do a great job. But here we have these interactive slicers or filters. So if we just want to see data for Q2, I can click that. That will filter my chart and my pivot table over here for Q2 only. If we wanted to clear the filter for product 1, we could do that. Maybe we only want to see product 3. And so you get the point here is that we can really quickly create an interactive report and dashboard even with pivot tables and pivot charts. We can, of course, add multiple charts to this, multiple pivot tables, and add all those to one sheet to give you a nice interactive dashboard. So a ton of functionality here with pivot tables. And that's my goal with this first part. Again, don't worry about following that. I went very fast there. So if it's your first time seeing pivot tables, don't worry about trying to memorize that. I just wanted to explain what a pivot table is. And like I said, pivot tables help us quickly summarize the data to create interactive reports and dashboards. It's a whole goal of the pivot table. And some great benefits of learning pivot tables. And this is our friend Andy. If you've seen some of my other YouTube videos, you might have seen Andy before. He's learning pivot tables in Excel as well. Like I said, they help us summarize and analyze data quickly. They help us discover new insights about our data. We can easily answer all the boss's questions, CFO, and all the questions they come up with. We can easily answer those with pivot tables. And we don't have to create or maintain complex formulas. So this saves us a ton of time. Like we just saw, we just built out an interactive dashboard in a matter of minutes, and all we did was drag and drop. We didn't type any formulas or anything like that. I didn't use the keyboard at all, actually, to create those. We just used we just did drag and drop, no formulas. And these are absolutely skills that employers are looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but there's always an interview question that comes up about pivot tables. I've seen this hundreds of times on the comments on our YouTube videos and stuff like that on our blog. Always an interview question about pivot tables, and hopefully you can kind of now just with a little glimpse of pivot tables see why. It's because they're so powerful and useful. And of course, this will help you become the Excel superstar of the office as well. So what are some maybe misconceptions or reasons that you're not using pivot tables now? One that I hear is that other people won't be able to use my files. Simply not true. Like we just saw, we can make our files actually easier to use when we have pivot tables in there. Another is that we're stuck with that pivot table layout formatting. Like we just saw, like maybe you want a more customized format or layout for your pivot table. It's actually 3 different layouts and then a bunch of options within those for pivot tables. And then if you want something even customized more than that, we can use the get pivot data function, or with Power Pivot, we can use the cube functions. There's a set of functions called cube that allow us to create very, very customized reports on any worksheet, but pulling the data in from a pivot table. Another kind of misconception is that they're difficult to update with new data. And there's tools that can help automate that. We'll see Power Query today and how that can help us automate that as well. And using Excel tables is another tip there that will help it update them with new data. Another myth is that they increase the size of the file. And that can actually be true, but there's ways to mitigate that. There's quite a few different ways to mitigate that, including using the data model, and you can reduce your file size. And then another one is that they're not as easy as it looks, and it doesn't work with my data. You know, sure, John just did that one and made it look super easy, but when I go try it, it doesn't work with my data. Yeah, so the number one issue I see or I hear is that they look easy, but pivot tables don't work with my data. That was also my problem when I started using pivot tables too. So my whole goal today is to help make pivot tables easier for you. I want you to be able to understand these things and make them easier for you to get your data in the right layout so you can use pivot tables. So that leads us to secret number 2, which is understanding the pivot table areas. And this is another cause of not understanding just how they work, and maybe they're not working with your data. So there's 4 areas that you can drag fields into within the pivot table fields list. And these are not created equal. They all do different things. You kind of saw that with my demo there. But I'm going to jump back over to Excel and explain this further, because it's very important to understand what each of these areas do. And I have a diagram here. And again, I'm going to send you out this file along with some cheat sheets and guides. So you can take notes, but don't worry about trying to copy all this down and all that stuff. I'll send this all out to you. And here's a diagram that kind of helps you see where each of these fields lands within this standard report structure that is the pivot table over here on the left side. But let's go into each of these and I'll explain how each works. So on this sheet here, I again have the same source data range. I'm going to quickly insert a pivot table. And we're going to put that over here in cell M5. And I'm just going to build out a pivot table and explain how these different areas work. So the first area we're going to start with is the values area. And right here, we're going to take the region field. Let me just scroll this up so you can see. We're going to take the revenue field and drag that into the values area. And typically with the values area, you're going to put fields in there that contain numbers. So we have the quantity field or the revenue field, both contain numbers. You don't have to, but typically that's what we're going to use in the values field. And that's because the values field does calculations. So this is the calculation engine of the pivot table. You can think of this as the formulas. However, these are formulas done in memory in the background, and then it's just going to display the answer in this cell right here. And this is just currently giving us the sum of revenue, which is the sum of column J here, the revenue column. So if we were to jump down and hit Control down arrow, and jump to the bottom here to the total row, that's exactly the total we get, 76414. So I'll hit Control up to jump back. That's what we have right here in the pivot table. Now, of course, you can change this calculation. You can do right click, and instead of sum, you can do a count, average, max, min, and even more options. Or you can show values as and do things like percentage of total, difference from, running totals, rank. So there's all kinds of calculation types you can do with pivot tables. So that's just the basics of the values area, and that's going to, again, do that calculation. So for right now, I'm going to remove the sum of revenue from the values area. We're going to start fresh again, and now I'm going to explain the rows area. So the rows area, for this, we'll take our region field again and put that in the rows area. And what that's done is given us a list of all the unique values from the region column. So if we look over here in column G, the region column, we can see we have a lot of repeating values. And that's absolutely fine. And we're going to talk more about this with source data, but this is absolutely fine to have all these repeating values here in the column, because the pivot table is going to find all of those, just give us a list of the uniques, and then list them here within the rows area. And the other thing it allows us to do, the rows area, is create relationships between columns in the data set for further analysis. And what I mean by that is if we were to take the product field and drag it in the rows area as well, we'll first put it under region. So now we have the region field and the product field here. We can see that we get a list of all the products under each region. And these are actually the products that were sold in each region. So all of these products exist in a row that contains East in our data set. So we have East product 1, down here we have East product 1 again. And if we continue to look through that or filter down that table, we would see that we get product 1, 2, 5, and 6. So these are all the products sold in the East region. Here's all the products that were sold in the Midwest region. Northeast had all 6 products sold, and so on. So this allows us to create this relationship to analyze this data a little further. We don't even have numbers in here yet. We're just looking at these 2 different fields in the rows area. And of course, we can move product above region. And when we do that, we're now going to see the regions that the products were sold in. So product 1 was sold in all 4 regions, same with product 2. Product 3 was only sold in 3 of the regions. So very quickly, again, just drag and drop, you get a totally different perspective or totally different report here that can be very useful when you're analyzing your data. And so next, I'm going to add the revenue field back to the values area. And when I do that, we're going to get that sum of revenue calculation for all of these data points. And it happens almost instantly. So I'll just drag and drop, and you can see that we now have the sum of revenue for each of these cross sections of data. The East region, product 1, Midwest region for product 1, and so on. So very quickly, the pivot table is able to calculate that, give us sum of revenue. Of course, we could change that to a different metric as well. And then finally, I'm going to explain I'm going to explain the columns area next. And with columns, it works the same as the rows area. So in this case, I'm going to take the quarter field and put it in the columns area. Now, typically with reports, we'll have some kind of time period going across the top. You don't have to. This could be any field going across the top here. But the columns area works the same way as the rows area. It's just going to give us a list of those unique values. And instead of displaying it vertically, it's going to display it horizontally here across the top of the pivot table. So of course, if we go over to the source data range and we look at the quarter column, we have the quarters repeating many times. Here's Q1 all the way down here. Q2 starts here and goes down, and so on. And that's exactly what we're going to have here, is just those unique values displayed across the top in the columns area. So columns and rows, both of these areas work very similar. They're just displayed horizontally and vertically. And then finally, the filters area allows us to filter down the entire pivot table. So I'm going to go ahead and take the product field and drag that into the filters area. You can, of course, have multiple fields in any of these areas. It's absolutely fine. But to just keep it simple for now, we'll put product up here. Now our report just shows, again, sum of revenue by region by quarter, and we can filter down the entire pivot table for a specific product. Now you could put year up here and filter it for a year, or any of your other fields you could put in the filters area to filter the entire pivot table for that specific item, or even multiple items. You can select multiple items here if you wanted to see product 1 and product 2, and you'd have those filtered here. So that's a brief overview of the areas. And it's important to know how each of those works, because they look the same over here in the fields list where we build out the pivot table, but actually each of them does a very different thing. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, and I will absolutely answer those at the end of the training today. Yeah, so I see some questions in there already. That's great. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions in there, and I'll get to them at the end of the training. I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you, but I also want to get through it and make sure we cover everything. So that's again an explanation of the 4 areas. I'm going to send this out to you as well, this cheat sheet here that explains it all. I'll send this to you, this little guide here you can use, especially when you're getting started. It'll help you with the areas. And then next, secret number 3, another very important concept here is understanding how pivot tables filter and calculate the source data. So we're going to look at the pivot table mechanics and actually look at how pivot tables work. Another very important concept. So jump back over to Excel. There we go. And I'm going to open this file in a new window. So View tab, new window. There we go. And I'll put these side by side. There we go. Put these screens side by side. If you don't know how I just did that, I have a blog post and video that goes over that, a new window, and then splitting these. I use a keyboard shortcut, which is the Windows key plus the right arrow to split the screen like that. I have a whole video tutorial that goes into that in detail. But what we're looking at now is the same file. We're looking at 2 different windows of the same file and 2 different sheets within this file. This will just allow me to explain how pivot tables work. I have this pivot table here on this sheet, and this pivot table uses the data on this sheet as the source. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and build out a very quick pivot table. Let's see, I'm going to do the same pivot table we've seen. I hope you're not getting bored with this one, but just to explain how this works. So we have sum of revenue by region, and how the way the pivot table calculates these numbers is through a process of filtering and calculating the data. And what I mean by that is, let's take this number right here, 6720. The way the pivot table figured this out is it went over to the source data range and it filtered the region column for the East region. We'll do that. And then it gets the total, the sum of revenue for that those rows is 6720. That's exactly what we see right here. And that's what we see here in the pivot table. Same thing if we were to filter the source data for the Midwest, then we would get the sum of revenue there, just one row, but that would be 3,000, and that's what we see right here. So that's the process of how the pivot table works. Now, that is super simple, but as the pivot table gets more complex, this process of filtering and calculating also gets a little more complex. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the filter here, and then we'll take the quarters field over in our pivot table here. We'll take the quarters field and put that in the columns area. And so now, let me close down the field list. This is the close button for the field list, and we can reopen it. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. There we go. So now we have a little bit more complex of a pivot table. So how's the pivot table get this number here? Because we now have quarters across the top. So this is now the sum of revenue for Q4 for East. And the pivot table does the exact same thing. So even though we have quarters across the top, the pivot table is still going to just filter down this column for Q4. So we'll do that, Q4. Okay, and then we want East region. So we'll filter this for East region, hit OK. Our sum of revenue is 5640, and that's exactly what we have here for the number for Q4. So that's how the pivot table calculates it. Now, it's not actually applying these filters to the source data range when the pivot table does calculations. It does that in background in memory on the pivot cache. But this is how it works. So if you're wondering why your pivot tables might not be working, and it's typically because the source data is in the wrong layout and the pivot table is not able to filter and calculate like we're seeing here in this vertical fashion. So all this filtering is done in a vertical fashion. So we want these long tables with repeating values to be able to do that filtering. So that's a fairly quick overview of how pivot tables filter and calculate the data. But it's extremely important to know how that works because again, if you don't have your source data in the right layout, which we're going to look at now, then the pivot table won't work, or it'll just cause you quite a bit of frustration to try and get it to work in the right way. Okay, cool. So that leads us to secret number 4, which is that it's all about the source data. This is by far the most important critical step. It doesn't matter what type of data you have, where you're getting your data from. It could be from a database, reporting system, general ledger. You can be exporting it from somewhere online. It can be any type of data. Doesn't matter what the data is. The most important step is that the data must be in the correct layout in order for us to use pivot tables. And like we saw earlier, when we answered that poll of why doesn't it work for me, this is typically the reason the pivot table is not working with your data. Typically what I see is that the source data is in the incorrect layout. So let's look at how to fix that, right? Because we want to be able to fix that and find ways to make pivot tables work for us. I'm going to go ahead and just close down that extra window for now. Open this one up here, and we'll look at the source data. So I showed this in the preview in this slide there. And what the source data should look like is what's called a tabular layout. That's what we have on the left here, this word tabular. It means table. And we want the layout of the source data to be in a tabular format. And tabular just means we're going to have one row of headers that describe each column. So this would be the header row that describes all of the data below it. So we have a sales column, product column, and so on. And as you can see, we have a lot of repeating values, and that's absolutely fine. Pivot tables like that. They love it. That's what they need. They need all these repeating values. Now, what you might be getting for source data is something that looks like this over here. And this is already in a report format. You can see we have the months going across the top here. This could be quarters, weeks, this could be something else. But if you have data that you're getting from exporting from your system that looks more like this, then we're going to need to do some conversion to get it into the right format, because the pivot tables won't really work with this data. And I should also point out that these two data sets are the exact same. This data over here and this data over here is the same. They're just in a different layout. And pivot tables need something that looks like this tabular layout. So what do? Well, the first rule to doing this conversion process and to making sure that your your source data is in the right layout, the first basic rule is that all values of the same type must be in one column. And same type is kind of important there if you do have values that are of different types. So maybe you have sales, and then maybe you have budget or forecast, some other numbers as well, or like we saw, we had quantity. Those would be different types. So sales numbers are all kind of the same type of data. So we want all of those values in one single column, like we have here. That's what this is showing. Kind of taking this and changing it to this long vertical column. That's the first step. And then the next step is to take all of the other fields that describe that data point and put them in the same row in columns next to it. So you can see here, that's what's happening in this visual here. So we have this number. If we start with this number 2010, 2010, that's where we get this number from in the report. And then we have other columns that describe that data point. And this row here is called a record set in database terminology. You don't need to know that or remember that, but that's kind of what you can think of here. This is a record set. So everything here is describing this data point. What does $2,010 mean? Well, that's the sales for product 2 in February for the EMEA region for company ABC. And so that's what we want to do. That's how we want to convert our data. Now, don't worry, you don't have to drag and drop the fields all like this to get this in the right format. There's ways we can automate this, but it's good to understand that this is what we want. We want this long, skinny table of data with repeating values so that the pivot table can filter and calculate the data. So that's the goal there. So How do we transform it? Well, this transformation process is typically called normalising the data, or a relatively newer term I think is unpivoting the data. We're kind of reverse engineering the data, unpivoting it, getting it back to what it should look like in that tabular format. And fortunately, we have a new tool called Power Query, well, relatively new tool called Power Query that makes this process really easy. And I want to show a preview of Power Query and how to do this. So here is an example of a really simple data set that's in the wrong layout. As we can see, we have months across the top, and we don't want that. We want to look something more like this, where we have months going in one column and the sales values going down in another column. So we want to convert this, and we can use Power Query for this. Now, Power Query is available for Excel 2010 and later. It's a free add-in from Microsoft up until Excel 2013, and then starting in Excel 2016, or if you're on Office 365, Power Query is now fully integrated into Excel. It's on the Data tab of the ribbon. And it's here in the Get and Transform section. It's undergone a few name changes, so it's called Get and Transform here, but this is actually Power Query. And so what I'm going to do, and just give you a very kind of quick overview. First, I'm just going to select a cell inside this table here, and then we're going to use this button here, which is hard to see, but that's from table or range. We can also get data from other sources too. There's a ton of different sources, get it from databases, all kinds of different databases, Azure data warehouses, data lakes, all that stuff, online, even from web pages, Facebook, all kinds of data sources. But we're just going to get it from a table in this workbook. I click that button, and that's going to open the Power Query editor. So this is a new window that opens up on top of Excel. We have Excel in the background. Let's see if I can kind of show that there. We have Excel in the background. We have the Power Query editor opening on top of it. And this is a data transformation tool. So what we're seeing here is a preview of our data. Our table's loaded up here. And then we have a ton of buttons up here that allow us to transform and make changes to this data. So we can do all kinds of things. Remove rows, remove columns, split columns by a delimiter, something like text to columns. We can merge and append queries, all different kinds of stuff we can do to our data to help clean it up. Now, the one thing we want to do for this is on the Transform tab, we have this Unpivot Columns button, which is absolutely amazing. So what I'm going to do is just select these month columns. I'm going to select the January column, hold the Shift key, and select the April column. So I have all my month columns selected. I'm just going to click this Unpivot Columns button. Just one click there, and it does the unpivot for us. So all that work is done, and we now have our data in the correct layout for a pivot table. And it adds this attribute column. We can double click this here to rename it. We're going to call that month. And then it also adds this value column. I'm going to double click to rename that revenue, if I can type, and hit enter, and just rename those columns. But now we have our data in the correct layout for our pivot table. And one other cool thing about Power Query is it's a full data automation tool. So what it's doing is it's, as we're taking steps, as we're clicking buttons here in the Power Query ribbon, it's actually listing out those steps over here in this applied steps window. And you can click on these and see what the data look like at each of those steps. So here's our source data. When we loaded it up, there's this automatic change type to change the data types of each column to text and numbers, or if you have dates. And then we unpivoted, and that's what this looked like. And then we renamed columns, and that's what happened there. So all these steps are recorded here and remembered, and next time we refresh this query with new data, those steps will be applied again. So now that we have this, I'm going to go to the Home tab, and we'll click this Close and Load button. This is to commit our changes. And when we do that, a new sheet is added to the workbook. Take just a second here. My computer's a little slower because I have the webinar software running. There we go. So we have a new sheet added to our workbook. And let me bring that into view. Oops, yeah, let me bring that in view. So we have new sheet, sheet 1, added to our workbook here with the output table right here. And then of course we could go create a pivot table based on this. So this is a table ribbon up here. You could do this from the insert ribbon as well. Summarize with pivot table. This time we'll put it on a new sheet instead of an existing sheet. And then we have that new pivot table right here. So of course we can just then build out whatever pivot table or report we want, sum of revenue by product, or whatever it is, we can just build out that pivot table based on that source data range that we have. So that's the power of Power Query. Now I went over it very quickly, but one other thing I want to show you there is how awesome this is for full automation. And what I mean by that, I'll go ahead and close this window here, is if we go back over to the source, if we go back to this sheet here where our original source data is, first of all, this is the data that we used for that query, and it has not changed. Power Query is not changing the original source data. It's adding a new sheet with the new data, the output of that query. So it's not going to change our original data or mess it up at all. But if we got new data, let's say we got some new data here, maybe I'll just add some new data to this, just some kind of dummy data there. We got new rows. Let's say we also got some new columns, maybe a few new months. Oops, I don't want that. There we go. A few new months have happened. So we now have May and June. We have new rows, new products to our report here. And we want to update our query with that. Well, we don't actually have to go make any changes to the query itself in this case. All we have to do is go over to the output table and right click it and choose refresh. This refreshes the query. And as you can see, my new data has been added down here to the bottom. We have new products. We have June in here, May and June. So we have all that new data here added to the table. And all we had to do is right click refresh. And then with our pivot table, same thing. We have this pivot table based on that source data. Right click refresh, or there's keyboard shortcuts for that, Alt F5, Alt F5. We'll refresh and we have our new data. So hopefully you can see, and of course I'm going a little quick here just to show a demo, a preview of this, of what the capabilities and the possibilities are. But the idea here is that we can take some data, maybe a report we're getting out of a system that's not cleaned up and formatted properly. We kind of put that in Power Query, do some transformations, make it look good, get it ready for pivot tables, output it, and then we have our reports, our existing reports already created. So this might take your weekly process of doing all that prep work down to a few right clicks to refresh data sources. I've done that plenty in my career. I've seen a lot of our members, our students do that as well. And it just makes their lives so much easier with some of these new amazing tools. Yeah, so that's just a little overview of Power Query. So there we go. So, and I also wanted to kind of share, I kind of asked I wanted to share how Power Query fits into the reporting process. And so I kind of have this three-step process, what I consider the reporting process, which is we're getting data out of some kind of system, we're exporting data and then importing that into Excel, or maybe directly connecting to a database and bringing that into Excel. And of course, we can use Power Query for that. So that's kind of the get data process there. We then analyze the data with pivot tables and formulas, of course, and that'll allow us to create reports and dashboards. And then we share the results. We distribute that to our decision makers, create PowerPoints, and gather feedback to then analyze the numbers further. And so I really feel like as an analyst or someone working with data, you want to be spending most of your time in this analyze phase, because this is where we're going to make the biggest impact if we're able to find insights in our data that are going to drive business decisions, right? We want to spend most of our time here, not most of our time here just getting the data into Excel and trying to clean it up and make it look good. Now, typically this is what we do. We spend so much time just getting data into Excel. By the time we do that and make it, workable with formulas, or now if you know how to use pivot tables, then we don't have as much time to analyze it. But fortunately, with tools like Power Query, we can speed up this process greatly. So that's kind of the goal of showing you Power Query and how this fits into the equation with pivot tables. It's another essential tool, I'd say, for using. You don't have to use it to use pivot tables if your source data is in the right format, but it will help you just automate this process. So we just saw how to, what we call unpivot or normalize the source data. We looked at how we can use Power Query for that. Now you could use formulas for that actually. I have a blog post on that. Excuse me. You could also use macros too. There's other ways to unpivot and clean up your data, and you can use VBA and macros. But Power Query, like I said, just a one button. I mean, your data might be more complex, so it might be more than a one button click there, but you could still use Power Query even in a little bit more advanced scenarios. And one of those might be something like this, where you have two different types of values. And in this case here, I just wanted to show this because this is another very common scenario where you might have revenue and budget numbers. And in those cases, you'd want to have those in two separate columns for the source data of a pivot table, because those are the two different types of data. And one kind of rule there is that if you can sum all values to get a meaningful result, then the value should be in a single column. So the sum of this column here is total revenue. The sum of this column here is total budget. If both of these were in the same column, and then you had another column over here for type and it said revenue or budget down the column, the sum of those two numbers together isn't meaningful. It doesn't mean anything. Revenue plus budget, is not really going to mean much. So you typically wouldn't want that. You typically want those in two separate columns. That's just another little tip there, and sometimes people get hung up on that. But if they're different types of data, put them in different columns. So this is kind of my light bulb moment with pivot tables. I didn't fully understand how they worked at first. It took time to learn them with a lot of trial and error. But once I understood that the source data was key, I was able to reverse engineer these reports to get the source data layout correct. And as we saw, that's critical because it also helps us create relationships with other tables for date and category groupings, and using lookup formulas to look up different lookup values like products, regions, all that kind of stuff. And we can also use it for tools like Power Pivot to create relationships with other data tables as well. This really allows us to go beyond the basic summary reports and compare data from multiple data sets. So a lot of power with these tools once you get the source data in the correct layout. I can't stress that enough, but I'll stop sounding like a broken record. And this is also an essential skill for careers in data. So if you're using data now, you already have a career in data, but we can use this pivot tables, I consider, are like the backbone of other business intelligence tools like Power Pivot. Power BI is really just a combination of Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power View for charting, which is Microsoft's business intelligence tool. We have tools like Tableau, which is another popular one, and many, many others. But the point is that with business intelligence tools like this, it allows us to create reports and charts and dashboards. Understanding how pivot tables work is critical for this. Pivot tables is really the underlying technology of all of these tools. That's how they all work, how they all operate. These tools just have more advanced features for formulas and relationships and things like that. So I've even done some research on new, I would say this is a new probably job or title with business intelligence roles on Glassdoor. And we're seeing now that there are these roles out there for business intelligence analysts and managers. And as you can see, the pay for these is really good because these jobs are in high demand. Companies need people that can analyze data quickly and gather insights about it. That's exactly what business intelligence is. It's kind of a fancy term, but if you're an Excel user using Excel, all these tools are kind of based out of Excel and new ways to analyze our data. So secret number 5 is that pivot tables are picky and the data needs to be cleaned up and formatted properly. So we already looked at the layout of the source data, but pivot tables also require the formatting to be correct for the source data as well. And I have this checklist I'm going to send you, which covers what I consider to be the 8 rules for formatting your source data. And I'll send this to you, so we're not going to go over it in a huge amount of detail. I'll just quickly show Excel and the sheet that you can check out here for, for formatting your source data. So we have some data here. We have text, dates stored as text, I should say. We have blank rows here. We have blank columns and some numbers stored as text. So all these things we need to be cleaned up. You can also use an Excel table. This is formatted as an Excel table. Insert tab, table. That will insert the table, and then we have the table design tool. If you're not using tables, that's fine, but that's another good skill to learn. And then once we have all those steps and our data is cleaned up, then we can use this for the source of a pivot table. So, and again, I'll send you out that guide, so we won't go over them in too much detail because typically your data is only going to have like 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those issues. It's not going to necessarily have all 8, but it's good to understand what those are. And I have that checklist for you, so you can go over those and make sure your data look good and it's all cleaned up. And I like this picture of this kid looking at this stack of cookies, because I kind of feel like this is how pivot tables are and how they feel about data, is they want this nice clean stack of source data, in this case cookies, in order to work properly. The pivot table needs this nice cleaned up stack of data. It looks delicious, right? So unfortunately, Excel leaves us with not that great of an explanation of the rules sometimes. Sometimes we get errors when we're creating a pivot table. This error actually means that there's blank columns in the source data range, although it doesn't directly tell you that. Sometimes we get the count defaulted instead of the sum in the values area. That's typically due to having blanks or text in the field that you're putting in the values area. Sometimes the group field button is disabled for dates and things like that. Again, that can be due to text or blanks. But Excel doesn't always tell us exactly what these problems are, and we're kind of left to figure that out on our own with trial and error. So in order to kind of save time with that, I'll just send you this checklist, because if you do all these steps, it'll make it much easier to create the pivot table and unlock some of those features we just looked at. Also help you prevent errors and incorrect results. Like I said, use Excel tables for the source data. So here's a quick recap of the 5 secrets. First is that pivot tables help us summarize and analyze our data quickly. We looked at the 4 areas and how they're not all created equal. I'll send you out that cheat sheet. We also looked at how pivot tables filter and calculate the source data. And this is critical for understanding how pivot tables work and then getting your source data in the correct layout. Because if you can filter and calculate to get a number, that means that you can create a pivot table to also get that number. And then we looked at the source data formatting and how to prevent some of those errors in that 8-step checklist. And also kind of just explain there how pivot tables are a necessary skill for data analysis. So I hope this has been valuable for you. If you've enjoyed today's presentation, we have 3 additional ways you can connect with us. First of all, you can go over to excelcampus.com/free and grab our free Excel Pro Tips ebook, and also join our Insiders newsletter, where we share tips and tricks and strategies to help you learn Excel. We also have a free webinar going on right now called the Modern Excel Blueprint. And during this webinar, I explain all the new power tools like Power Query, Power Pivot, even pivot tables and dashboards, and also macros and VBA, and how all of these tools and features of Excel fit together to help you automate processes, save a ton of time with your job, and become the Excel hero of your organization. And you can learn more about that at excelcampus.com/webinar. Now, if you want to become the Excel hero immediately, you can also dive straight in to our Elevate Excel training program. And this is our flagship training program where we go in depth and teach you step by step the necessary skills you need to learn to, again, automate Excel and produce amazing results that matter to your boss, your colleagues, and your organization. You can learn more about that at excelcampus.com/elevate. So again, I hope this has been helpful. Of course, we look forward to connecting with you. Reach out to us at any of these links here. I look forward to learning more about your story and helping you learn Excel. My name is John Acampora. Thanks again. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.